Results for private schools are set to be released tomorrow and for public schools on Thursday. For many matriculants, the festive season was heavily clouded by agonizing mental stress and anxiety over their results. Let's bring in clinical psychologist Nevern Subermoney to help us out with the advice on how to cope with anguish and anxiety over matric exam results. Nevern, thank you so much for making the time.
Hi, thanks for having me.
No doubt it will be a difficult time, especially for those who've not performed well. What do you say to them?
Well, I think the first thing I would do is normalize what they're going through. I think whatever distress they are feeling, it's probably been felt by a large proportion of the students. So it's very normal to feel anguish, to feel stressed, to be concerned about your future, because our stress and our anxiety always scales with the consequences of whatever we're stressed about. And in this case, the consequence for many people is what they're going to be in the future, what they're going to do one day, and etc. So I think the first thing I would say is that it's totally normal, but once that anguish and that stress starts to interfere with your ability to cope with the situation, then we need to think about alternative ways to deal with it.
Yeah, you're speaking about the first person, but expectations from parents and peer pressure, all those weigh heavily at these times, heavily stressed students. What can be done for students confronted with these added pressures?
Absolutely. So I think there are two ways to address it. One would be at that level of the parents or the surrounding context or the fellow colleagues. And what I would say to them is just to remember that a lot of students are heavily psychologically affected by matric results because school is a huge part of what a child knows up to that point in their life. So just to be sensitive to the fact that children may be struggling with things like anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, low self-efficacy, high levels of stress. And then I think to the student, I think what I would say to them is to remember that the people around them that are putting expectations on them oftentimes are concerned about their future and their well-being. So it's very important for the student who is placed under a lot more pressure from those around them to remember that they might have good intentions with that. Because if it's not framed in that way, then the surrounding pressure can be villainized rather than be used as a tool to help propel them forward.
So for those who have prevailed, have passed, but haven't done as well as expected, what can be advised here?
Yeah, so I think the students need to remember not to internalize the results and not to let it leak back into their self-worth. Because what we see in psychological science is often our beliefs and our expectations of ourselves can influence whether we are successful one day. In psychology, we call that self-efficacy, because we've realized through research that if a person believes that they are capable, they actually end up performing better, even if they have the same abilities as everyone else. So it's not just the aptitude and the ability that matters, but also what you think is possible for you. So I think a strong piece of advice here would be for students to not internalize their marks and think that it is a reflection of their ability or their worth, because there are many variables that contribute to whether someone performs well during this specific narrow period. There's the amount of support that they have around them, whether it's social or academic. It is the household, the state of the household. It's also things like nutrition also affect a learner's performance. So it's very important for them to remember that there are so many things that are going on, and it's not necessarily that they are a failure or not. Because once they internalize that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The future is still ahead of them, and there are ways to respond and adapt, even if your marks are not as good as you want them to be.
Yeah. So there's two choices to make here for those who have succeeded. It's either academic discipline to follow or career choice. How should they be approaching this terrain?
Yeah, so I think it obviously it's very, very specific on the specific situation. Not everyone has the feasibility for the vast array of options. So they have to consider what is immediately feasible for them, just practically in terms of their situation, the amount of finances that they have, the amount of support that they have, their ability to move to a different location. So feasibility is obviously a confining factor. But I think another thing to really bear in mind here is that they should keep their interests in mind as well, because interest can be a better predictor of success than IQ in a specific field. Because oftentimes you need a certain level of intellectual capacity to enter certain fields, but what keeps you going in the long term and what helps you to ultimately prevail in whatever path you choose is your ability to persist at it, your ability to keep going. And oftentimes your ability to keep going will be found in work that is meaningful to you, or it will be found in work that you're highly interested in and that keeps you engaged.
Yeah, some depth there, but just looking at grade 1 and 8 students, so many are still waiting to be placed in schools. The new school term has already started, friendships formed already. For those still waiting to be placed, how do they just cope with this time of uncertainty?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I'm sure a lot of them are feeling quite anxious, quite stressed, feel like they're falling behind. I have a few suggestions off the top of my head. One would be that the stress and anxiety that they're feeling serves a function. And that's important to realize. For any emotion that you're going through, you're feeling that emotion for a specific reason. And you can, once you understand the reason that you're feeling that, you can actually use that emotional source as fuel to help you cope with the situation. So for example here, if they're feeling stressed and they're feeling anxious about falling behind, that stress and worry could be turned into problem solving in terms of how can I keep up with the curriculum even if I'm not at school? Are there children I could speak to who know what's being covered at the specific moment? Are there other people who could support me once school does get started? So I think it's a very important thing to do, to turn worry into problem solving, because that's essentially what worry is. Worry is emotional problem solving. I think another thing that they could do to cope here is definitely to look to who their social support is and who their academic support is, because at the end of the day, they're going to have to catch up this work at some stage. So they're going to have to borrow time from somewhere in their lives. So a bit of preparation around how am I going to be able to borrow time, and who could I turn to support me through this? We're social beings, so whenever we're stressed or anxious, there's nothing that helps make us feel better like having other human beings who are able to provide us a bit of comfort, who we can speak to and who can support us and help scaffold us to a better space. And then I think the final thing I'd just recommend here is that is related to the social aspect and the self-esteem aspect, because a lot of children who are going back at a later stage might feel that they're not coping with the work because there's something wrong with them. So it's very important for them to remember that when they do re-enter the system and they're not part of a group of friends like everyone else, or they're not as far ahead with academics, again, they should not internalize that, because it's just a function of them not having been in school rather than something being wrong with them.
I'm glad you're talking about support. What would you advise teachers regarding their role in this whole process?
I think, teachers already have quite a difficult job, having to mold so many unique and different minds in a specific situation. But I think to add more pressure to them, I would further emphasize the importance of giving individualized attention to students who have fallen behind, because again, they're going to have to borrow that time from somewhere. And if teachers can help to lend a bit of that time back to them, to give them a bit of individualized attention, then they'll be able to provide the foundation for anything that they've missed. Because oftentimes our learning is scaffolded. So everything that in many subjects, what you learn, the next piece you learn has to be built on that first piece that's been learned already. So I would say for teachers to make sure that each level is properly cemented in the student's mind so that they don't internalize that there's something wrong with them. Because once they start doing that, they stop trying. Once they stop trying, they get poorer results. And then that creates a feedback loop where the poorer you do, the less you try, and the less you try, the poorer you do.
Nevern Subermoney, thank you so much for making the time to speak to us. Such important points there. Nevern Subermoney is a clinical psychologist, just looking ahead to that release of matric results.